Namaste and Jai Hind. And against the backdrop of the G20 preparations, and we're all building up to the summit level talks, but Prime Minister Narendra Modi is going to air dash to Indonesia to attend two important meetings, the ASEAN meeting and also the East Asia meeting. Why is it so important? And especially at a time when there is huge domestic crisis brewing in China, and also the attitude of nations in and around us all across this entire region. What is their approach towards China? Are they looking beyond China? Or are they looking at an attitude for China plus one? Or is it that entire region which China is actually actively coveting, especially the waters in the South China Sea, that is alienating these nations which once were wholly dependent on the CCP-led China or the People's Republic of China? Let's put these questions and try and understand and get some perspective with two very erudite and well-learned gentlemen, Professor Swaran Singh of the JNU and also Ambassador Anil Tribunal. Namaste, thank you very much for your time. Ambassador Anil Tribunal, how important is this? It has got to be important, otherwise PM would not be air dashing to Jakarta on the eve of the G20 summit.
Yes, absolutely, Anand. I think that it is our own periphery and strategic periphery, so to say. For a long time, I remember in 1990s, I was at one of the meetings where Singapore Prime Minister was speaking, and he said that India only looks towards the west. You don't look towards the east, which is your natural habitat. Very exact words, and they rung. Unfortunately, at that time, we had already started engaging with them, but this relationship with the ASEAN has really grown very fast in the last 30 years. Now we have a comprehensive strategic partnership. As you know, in 2022, we completed 30 years of our relationship, which expanded across the spectrum. And these countries are also looking at India as some kind of a lever against an hegemonistic China. As you mentioned, the thing is that very recently there was this cartographic aggression by China, which against India as well as against these countries. So some of them were very vocal. But as you rightly mentioned, that this is also a divided house today. ASEAN has a lot of potential, has tried to have a lot of uniformity within it. It's one of the regional groupings which has been very successful in carrying forward various initiatives. But Myanmar is one of their biggest challenge. And then there are certain countries that, because of their proximity to China or dependence on China, are unable to take the joint comprehensive action. So China continues to play a major role in the ASEAN centrality, and therefore India's presence there is seen as some kind of a balancer, in my view. And for us, it is very important because it has also become very important for our Act East policy, as well as our combination of the Act East and the Neighborhood First policy, which we are displaying through the BIMSTEC. So there is a lot of connectivity issues, whether it is digital, maritime connectivity or physical connectivity, that we have continued to work together in a big way. And the fact that Prime Minister Modi really went to this, I think that this shows the great importance India attaches to our ASEAN. We also invited all the leaders, 10 leaders to India for the Republic Day as well. And so I think that this is a relationship which is growing very fast, growing very strongly, and also within the backdrop of the tensions in the Indo-Pacific that are growing. Everybody agrees and knows that there has to be a centrality of ASEAN, but also how do the ASEAN leaders, they have come out with their own Pacific strategy. Look at this. That their own centrality, because they don't want to be in the firing line of either of the two, because they're dependent for their security, many of them on United States, and for their economic dependence on China. They are all part of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, the BRI and other things. So I think that they are in a bit of a fix.
Professor Swaran Singh, is this also building up to the leadership summit important because India is engaging as the voice of the global south? That's how we are positioning ourselves. We are engaging with the Africa group of nations. So is this also to try and get the ASEAN nations and also the East Asia nations to say, okay, you play our voice to get the backing, saying that whatever India negotiates on their behalf will be acceptable to them?
And there is no doubt, Anand, this air dash, as you mentioned, to Jakarta, despite hosting G20 summit in New Delhi, definitely has multiple motives behind it. Of course, as you mentioned, any multilateral gathering at this stage would add on to building of consensus for the G20 summit meeting. But definitely there is much more behind 20 years of summit meetings with ASEAN being founding member of East Asia summit meetings. But more interesting, lately India is emerging as an alternative partner for not just economic partnerships, but also defense cooperation partnership. ASEAN is looking at India as an alternative between China and United States. And indeed, that has been something fairly causing triggering anxieties in Beijing as to how India is able to build that enormous maritime cooperation, naval exercises, all kind of visits, port visits. That is a new India that is visible. And in that backdrop now, I think the latest glue is this cartographic aggression, as Ambassador mentioned, which for the first time saw at least 2 of the 5 or 4 ASEAN nations that had claims on South China Sea immediately responding, just like India has immediately responded to the issue of maps. And to some extent, I would say this has been clearly inspired by India withstanding on the border Chinese pressures for more than 3 years, that rest of the neighborhood is beginning to notice. And I think if that kind of coalition of neighborhood can work together under India taking the leadership role in that sense to put certain restraints on China's behavior, which are not necessarily American-driven, US-driven, but neighbors themselves come together and begin to speak one language. ASEAN has not been able to withstand together jointly against Chinese on South China Sea dispute. And therefore, at bilateral level, Chinese are able to pressurize, arm twist several of these leaders. But if they begin to collate their equations with India on that issue, I think they will see a far more greater influence building together and dealing with the issue of China's aggressive attitude on South China Sea or on border with India. In that sense, there are multiple, I think, elements that bring this air dash to enormous, intense negotiations with all of these leaders. And of course, as you mentioned, the most immediate, of course, also will be building consensus for the G20 final declaration. And in that sense, Indonesia being the last presidency of the G20 may have several logistical minor issues which can sort of really be put together now to make sure that we can build consensus on larger number of issues and how to deal with minimizing the impact of irritants that are already visible as challenges for building a joint declaration.
Because PM, while speaking with Money Control, did mention that Indonesia, India, and Brazil, 3 developing nations, are the troika. So past, present, and the next chair. And that itself means that there will be voice for developing nations. But Ambassador Tribunal, Professor Swaran Singh touched upon a very important aspect of this visit, that is the defense exports and the defense collaboration. For India to become a manufacturing hub, our defense factories have to start working. There's a huge defense corridor planned, and for which you need to have huge offtake. Do you think the ASEAN nations can be an interesting market for our guns, howitzers, our Tejas fighters, the light combat aircrafts? We've also supplied some missiles to some of these nations, and we are actively in the process of more collaborations. Can we manufacture submarines and also warrior ships for them and get our ship manufacturing capacities or shipbuilding capacities activated? Are these all important aspects which are key also to our own growth if we want to gallop to a 30 trillion economy?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that our defense export targets, joint ventures, R&D, joint manufacturing in the defense sector, these are very important. At the same time, the fact that we were able to break into the Philippine market, which is mostly driven by the United States goods, then we were able to provide the BrahMos missile discussion. Vietnam is another country that will be doing. Indonesia has also shown great interest. And of course, in the domain, and we have also gifted some to Vietnam, as you know, some of these patrol boats, and also working together in the defense sector in a comprehensive manner, actually, and they're in a very strategic way that India is proceeding forward to create a niche and carving out its space, defense space in these sectors. For the first time, as you know, that in the month of May, we had the ASEAN-India defense ministers meeting last November, and then we had the first exercises actually with the ASEAN, which had not happened earlier. So that is something which shows that maritime security is extremely important. Now, Indonesia, in that sense, has emerged as a very major partner for us. As you know, from Port Blair, we are trying to work together with them on a direct. There's the closest access that India has. So
Hmm.
within the domain of maritime security, some of these countries are going to be extremely important for us. And I guess that the India is working on uh, that
Hmm.
strategy.
But do these nations have that kind of money, Professor Swaran Singh? Do these nations have that kind of money to afford us, or are we going to make it affordable compared to a China and a US supplying arms?
There are two elements to answer this question. One, India's defense exports are often seen as relatively cost effective. They may not be cutting edge technologies very often, but they could be appropriate technologies having advantage of pricing in that sense. Second, the confidence of sharing technology. Not every country is easily willing to share technologies with other countries. BrahMos, for example, is a state-of-art missile, and India has been able to supply that to at least two countries and potentially
Hmm.
three of them. So in that sense, acceptability of transfer of technology, cost effectiveness of technologies, and finally, of course, ASEAN is not going to add on any new orders. ASEAN is fundamentally looking at diversification of
Hmm.
their procurement, just like India is looking at diversification of its procurement of defense equipment. So ASEAN will continue to enhance and sort of strengthen its defenses, and that will happen way beyond just procurements. It's also, as Ambassador mentioned, in terms of familiarizing each other, in terms of port
Hmm.
visits, in terms of boarding and seizing and seizure and humanitarian assistance and all kinds of other exercises, conferencing. This year only, Singapore is hosting two of the major events on International Maritime Defense Exhibition, and other
Hmm.
one is International Maritime Defense Conference. So that kind of familiarization and domain awareness with each other and the display of that kind of mutual bonhomie itself is, I think, that is far more signaling. And we all understand the shared challenge here is China. And for ASEAN countries, it is the South China Sea, which is a problem for them. And for them, this gradual incremental display of India becoming increasingly engaged. You remember ASEAN almost for about 3 decades from 1990s wanted India to be there as a countervailing power. India
Yeah.
was the one which is shy and didn't want to play that role. India has always said we don't want to see the region militarized. That we still hold as a strong principle, but kind of maritime cooperation, kind of defense cooperation, the kind of defense exports that are beginning to happen now is also part of the larger picture. It's only in 1990s that India, for example, took a major leapfrogging, saying we will be supplying weapons. And it's only about last 5 years that we are really pursuing defense exports. And I think last year we touched $1.5 billion for the first time. So in that sense, there's a whole transformation which is happening in India's way of approaching international community, international relations, and dealing with Southeast Asian countries, dealing with China. And also ASEAN, which was always ready to always engage India as a countervailing power, is willing to engage India on its own terms. And that is a kind of a different opportunity for ASEAN countries, which are either dependent on United States for security or dependent on China for trade. They are, in fact, trade and investments are also seeing a boost in last couple of years, despite the fact that India couldn't join RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. But at bilateral level, we are having a free trade agreement with them. And in that sense, bilateral trade investments also is going up. So for ASEAN, it's a very interesting alternative of a very different new kind, where defense cooperation and economic cooperation can provide them an alternative from being hostage to either United States or China.
What does cultural affinity or similarities with the Hindu roots, Buddhist roots, does this act as an icing? That's one more dynamic I want to bring in, Professor Swaran Singh, and then final comment by Ambassador Tripoli. Yeah.
I think it's not just the cultural affinity that we have. We have also noticed that Prime Minister Modi's foreign policy has clearly tried to front load the cultural connections and connections of diaspora. So in that sense, they have become locomotives of pursuing India's foreign policy objectives in that sense. So that revives the whole focus on the connect which always existed, but is now being used as a cushion, as a leverage to build that strong bilateral strategic partnership. It is now comprehensive strategic partnership with ASEAN, which is being pursued. Then rest of the things only fall in place and perhaps also facilitate the kind of mutual trust, mutual understanding that can grow, and that is what is significant. So yes, cultural affinity was always there, but it is now being clearly front-loaded strongly as a tool of foreign policy to push those foreign policy objectives.
Yeah, can this be perhaps the mithai ka dabba that you give, Ambassador Tribunal, to ensure that some of the other things are also there is a yes that happens. In the sense, cultural tourism can be encouraged. Nations like Indonesia, Vietnam, or this entire region, actually, all of them, Cambodia, they can all be encouraged to come visit India, because a lot of the destinations which are pilgrimage for Buddhists, Hindus there are here. And India is only encouraging cultural tourism and cultural cooperation.
You are absolutely right. I think that P2P connect is always a thread that binds the people. I mean, it's quite easy to do that and to create this kind of connectivity through the cultural and civilizational heritage that we have with these countries. I mean, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, Indonesia, the Muslim country, it still has Garuda as its symbol. And on the rupee also they have the Saraswati and everything that they worship even now. I mean, you can imagine that they having a majority religion of Islam, it has not changed their basic character. So these countries feel natural affinity towards India. And Prime Minister Modi, as Professor Swaran Singh said, is correctly, I mean, that this is a very focused initiative, be it the Buddha circuit, be it the religious other circuits, or the direct flights have now started to many of these countries. So, which is also a very important thing. And I think that there will be a growing interest in India, and from India also towards these countries. It would become easily. I hope simply that somehow they are able to develop some kind of an India ASEAN visa for the Indians. So it'll be much easier for us to, our businesses as well as tourists to travel.